Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulina. Welcome everybody to Islamic Finance Podcast with me, Almir, Colan. And as usual, now I'm joined with Maryam, my daughter. Maryam, how are you? Welcome.
Good, alhamdulillah. Thank you.
All good?
For having me here again.
Maryam is obviously helping us a little bit with a point of view, and we have a little bit of a discussion, so it makes it more lively and adds some other dimension. Last time we talked about Islamic economy, 3 important pillars and how it works. We try to put certain perspective, how to frame a problem, how to look at things. And today we will continue with one particular case study and one point of view to sort of look deeper into the issue. A lot of people are struggling. Today, actually, I was listening part of a podcast of one comedian, used to run a show, Jon Stewart, with Joe Rogan. And much of the podcast, although they were talking about politics, somehow turned into this discussion about economy. And everything that Jon Stewart was talking, which he used to host the Daily Show. And on this program, he talked about how he got saturated with sort of always repeating the same story, and he almost got burned out and frustrated. But when he dig down into the real reasons, inequality and what he saw as some sort of structural problems that people not getting ahead, he started giving his own version of the solution. And that is how we can make it all go away, basically, with those socialist ideas. And at one time, discussion turned into how he was having the conversation with some bankers and these financial products that destroyed economy, and how people were bailed out. Banks were bailed out through the stimulus. His solution is, why didn't you just, instead of bailing out the banks, give people money who were struggling to repay the mortgages? I apologize for pausing the podcast. Just to clarify, I'm talking about global financial crisis from 10 years ago that happened as a result of these financial products and derivatives that crashed the housing market. The response by government was to bail out big banks and insurance companies. With that clarified, let's get back to our podcast. The answer that he received was, this is a moral hazard. And the way he explained it and what it is the moral hazard is something that incentivizes the wrong behavior. So he said, it doesn't make sense. Why don't you just go and, instead of giving millions of dollars to organization, give every household $50,000. They can just continue doing what they're doing. We don't have a problem. We don't create a problem. That was the idea. And so him and the host sort of agreed that this is a very common sense approach. That's it. We got it. Nobody can think of. Let's put aside every other problem that is going on. Number one, that those people who got into these mortgages, got into them while they couldn't afford them. So even if you give them $50,000 now, give them the next 12 months, they'll still be behind, still foreclosure. So all you have done in that case, you just delayed inevitable collapse. Because those people were given that money that couldn't afford those loans. That's why they were called subprimes. Put aside predatory behavior by those bankers who were structuring and giving those when they knew that they couldn't afford because they had financial incentives to do it. Okay, so put all of that aside, which is in its own something you would obviously think about. But this idea of incentivizing wrong behavior, it's even more dangerous than both of these combined. Because the problem when you incentivize wrong behavior is that there is a mindset in a people. If they can exploit something and somebody will pay for that mistake, they will continue doing that over and over, and you don't have enough money to pay for that. So if you can create derivatives where you give money to the people who cannot afford it, give them loans, not the money, loans, to go into something they cannot afford, that will then be sold to somebody else, and you will profit from that. And then the government will come to bail out the people who took it. That creates even more massive problems. That doesn't solve anything. Just like those huge, especially insurance companies and other banks that were gambling. I don't see why taxpayers should pay for them. If it is really capitalism, they should be left to their own consequences of their own deeds. They were gambling, but in any case, why would you want to bail them out? There were some maybe bigger issues why they bailed them out, and they give us explanations for sake of all of us. Apparently, they were too big to fail. But the problem is they are today even bigger to fail. Now, the even bigger problem would be if you start giving people $50,000, $100,000, that would actually incentivize them to take even more loans that they cannot afford because the government will step in. So this ability will not benefit those people that you give money. It will benefit those banks even more. Because what you are doing, again, is that people are just pass-through vehicle for that money to end up in those banks. You understand? So that money is not for people to be given $50,000 and they go for holiday or they get their life together. No, that's just to repay that loan. So when I look at that, and then they're both sort of laughing and nobody thought of this and that. Just a basic understanding of how economy works, how the incentives work. It just strikes me as so irresponsible. People are commenting on the nonsense, and they're talking about things that completely miss the point. And so we are then developing this economic system based on certain incentives where there is no doubt. You put incentives certain way, that's where they are going to lead. Whatever you incentivize, whatever you reward, that's what you're going to get more of. So if you incentivize reckless borrowing or reckless lending, you're going to get more of that. That's going to cost everybody much more. In the same way, nobody is talking what we should penalize. What are the behaviors that you need to penalize? And so I just want to give a little bit of a couple of stories just about incentives and how that works in a system and how we are responding. Today, there is a lot of inequality in a society, a lot of reasons historically, and people say structurally, or depending on which country you're talking about. In US, there is now discussion about racism, whether it's historical or today, present, how it affected historically before, what are the consequences of today. In some other countries, some other issues. Like here in Australia, Indigenous Australian, how they were treated in terms of the land, in terms of even genocides that were committed and so on. In many different countries, different story, different question, different people. Sometimes in the same country, you go to Europe or in Middle East, or Africa, people were enslaving each other, conquering and doing all kinds of things. Just today, President of France is talking about last week, Islam is a problem, where I have some Algerian friends who tell me in 70s, million people died because they wanted to get rid of occupation by the French. They had to, million people die for fighting against the colonial powers. So all of these things, history and present and everything, comes in the middle of what we are discussing. How do we go? How do we fix? How do we get ourselves to the right place? What is the way to move forward? I'll give you an example of economy. It's in the story of the Prophet ﷺ, who told us the example of the person abiding by Allah's order and restriction in comparison to those who violate them is like example of those persons who drew lot for their seat in a boat. Some of them got seat in the upper part and the other in the lower part. So when they later needed water, they needed to go up to bring water. So those in the lower part, they didn't have obviously water, so they needed to go up. When they were doing that, it used to trouble those people on the top deck. So they started saying, let us make a hole in our share of the ship and get water, saving those who are above us from troubling them. So they had a good intention. Intention was, you have those people up. It looks like they don't want to share. Rather than things trickling down, water, let us drill our own water, okay? Now, these people come up with a solution. They dig the hole, and the Prophet ﷺ said, if the people in the upper part left the others do what they had suggested, all the people of the ship would be destroyed. But if they prevented them, both parties would be safe. So here it's an interesting scenario, which is that when you drill a hole to get what you want, this is that incentive that you create. You have incentive that is created by lack of wealth, but your response is something that will invite the flood that will sink you down. Today, many people feel like people on the lower deck, not having enough, drowning in the salty water, and it's slowly sinking the entire ship. One of the issue here is that people down are really not producing anything. They are basically depending. They are in a poverty or situation where they can't do much. Now, the question becomes in all of these economies is that, the standard one, should you let them catch their own fish? Should you teach them? Should you do it together? And how do you solve that inequality? So while I was reading Ibn Khaldun, I came across this interesting thing, and he was talking about various aspects of living. But before I go with the solution to make this all work better, I forget to say that we need to do our simultaneous sip of coffee with everybody. So I hope you are in the mood. And here's, we invite you for this sip with us. If you have coffee or a tea or a water or whatever it is that you're holding, we invite you now. 3, 2, 1. Bismillah. Now with that simultaneous sip, you see how entire economic confusion is going away. You can feel it. You can feel it. Clarity is coming. Ibn Khaldun talks about some of these issues. So here's very interesting, something that I came across in chapter 5. So he said that man by nature needs something to feed him and to provide for him in all the conditions and stages of his life, from the time of his early growth to his maturity and on to his old age. God created everything in the world for man and gave it to him, as indicated in the number of the verses in the Quran. All right? Man's hand stretches out over the whole world and all that is in it, since God made man his representative on earth. All right? That's a quite interesting observation, maybe for some people who don't maybe understand the role that people play on this earth. Here's where it gets interesting in terms of understanding these common sense things that at least 10, 20, 30 years ago used to be common. Every man tried to get things. In this, all men are alike. Thus, whatever is obtained by one is denied to others, unless he gives something in exchange. That is what the world is. People want something. So once you get that, for other person to get that same thing,
You need to have something you want.
That's right. You need to engage in exchange. When he has control of himself and is beyond the stage of these original weaknesses, he strives to make a profit so that he may spend what God gives him to obtain his requirements and necessities through barter. He continued discussion, which I'm going to skip to the most interesting part why I'm reading this. And that is that being a servant is not a natural make of making a living. So here he talks about government or people at a high position who hire others to do things for them. So he's saying that therefore they employ people who will take charge of such things for them. They give these people wages out of their own money. This situation is not praiseworthy from the point of view of manliness, which is natural to men, since it is weakness to rely on a person other than yourself. So for me, this is a quite interesting framing. This idea of relying on yourself and bringing that, especially here, to the masculinity part, ability to take care of something. And he says here that it also adds to one's duties and expenditure and indicates a weakness and effeminacy that ought to be avoided in the interest of masculinity. However, custom causes men nature to incline towards the thing to which it becomes used. Man is a child of customs, not the child of his ancestors. It's interesting that he ascribes working for someone as a weakness. And part of honor of man is being able to take care of yourself. Many economists until late 80s thought that Soviet-style communism, socialism, is working fine. And Paul Anthony Samuelson, a Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, who was called the father of modern economics and also described as foremost academic economist of the 20th century, in 1989 said, contrary to what many skeptics had earlier believed, the Soviet economies prove that a socialist command economy can function and even thrive. What he was using, there was a graph, basically shows US versus USSR. That was Russia before, what they called it before. So the graph goes where USSR economy is moving and is projecting to overtake in 90s and 2000 and later on, depending on which, there are two different projections, to overtake US economy. And the reason for this led this person to say that this is a proof that if you do what command-style economy is suggesting, it should work. The collapse of the communism happened as the Soviet Union broke 2 years later after that statement. Few years later, the same economist admitted that Soviet central planning was failed model. But here's the question. How did he miss the signs? What is we can look as a patterns that can be useful for us today? So when we look at, let's say, First, Second World War that this economist was talking about and recovery, both systems, capitalism and socialism, they would perform well in different stages. And I talked a little bit about it last time. When you look at after the Second World War, America was doing quite well. And the reason for that was the rest of the world was destroyed. So they were building the rest of the world. They had a lot of money, the infrastructure, built shipyards, factories. It was not bombed and destroyed like Europe and other countries. Now, on the top of that, a lot of the scientists from all around the world, the greatest minds of the time, went to US. And they started inventing everything from your TVs, washing machines, cars, better, everything, microwave, whatever you can think of, they were exporting that. Not just exporting, they were bringing the money, they were buying things. The rest of the world was destroyed. At the same time, you see the other superpower led by Russia that became opposite bloc. After the Second World War, you had this NATO-based Western World Alliance, which was led by America, US, and then you have, people don't remember, before Cold War, Warsaw Pact, which was led by Russia and these eastern states. In any case, they were more socialist. So what socialist in this command economy, and that's where the word communism, communal, as a community thought. And I know when I was in primary school, I would go to these camps where we would go, all of us from the school, we would go and we would work on these big projects for the state, for the glory of our state. It was a fun time for us. In any case, when you have a government able to say half of the population, you will go dig the roads, dig the tunnels, do manufacturing, for example. It mobilizes massive resources to do something. And then it says to other half or the third, you will do growing, agriculture, and so on. In that moment, at this particular time, in short term, you have huge growth. As huge amount of resources concentrated, and you're starting from nothing. So then you have seen all of this growth. But what starts happening is that as this matures and more nuances are needed, what do you think happens?
There's no incentive for people.
There is no incentives. People get tired of it. And that's you get suboptimal solutions. You don't anymore. There is no reason. Bureaucracy start growing. Socialism would grow then large bureaucracy that would not be able to answer new problems and surgically address new challenges that require innovation and lean performances, as well as, so it not only it could not change to new way, better way, improvements, but there was no mechanism, no incentives to abandon old ways. In order to demonstrate this particular case of what happens when we adopt this kind of economic model, let's analyze a specific case study. I picked up this story from a Planet Money podcast titled Secret Document That Transformed China. We have seen tremendous growth of China in the last several decades. So here's the story. This is from the transcript of the podcast that I mentioned. So it says that it began in a secret, with a secret document hidden in the roof of a mud hut. And people who signed back in 1978, they were afraid that the document and idea behind it might get them executed. Think of that. There was some document where people thought about what to do in their village. They were farmers. And the new way of thinking how to go ahead, managing themselves, might get them executed. So think of that just situation. The system is set up where we are all for the workers, for everybody, but having different thought to do with your life what you want can get you executed. Just think of that moment. And that's not just in China, that was in every communist country. In Yugoslavia, they had something called Naked Island, Goli Otok, where they used to send prisoners. In Russia, and they have these gulags and all of these prisons and so on. So story is from the rural village, and I don't know exactly the pronunciation. It's Xiaogang. Today, this village has paved roads, new factories, but in 1978, they were just muddy path, houses of dirt and straw. This was at the height of communism in China. Everyone worked on the village collective farm. The idea was people would work together for the common good. So they interviewed this person, Yen, who was a farmer back then. And he described that nobody owned anything in his village. He says, I use oxen to farm, but they were not mine. They belonged to the group. And then he said, back then, even the piece of straw belonged to the group. Individuals didn't own anything. At one meeting with Communist Party officials, a farmer asked, what about teeth in my head? Do I own these? No, was the answer. Your teeth belong to the collective. Okay? This is what it is. Okay? So in theory, the government would take what the collective grew and would distribute then food to each family. See? No incentive to work. But whatever you produce, we will take everybody's fruits of work and then we will give you what we think you need. So no incentive to work and no incentive to go out early in the morning. Why would you get out in the morning if you're just going to get whatever bureaucracy decide you should have? You don't need to produce. Why would I produce 10 units of work or 20 when I could produce 1 unit of work and just get still whatever I'm still getting? So then this farmer is saying, whether you work hard or don't work hard, everyone gets the same. So people don't want to work then. And then after the harvest, the government collects what everyone has grown and gives the village an allotment of food. But in the cases of this particular village, as it is often in these countries, allotment was never enough. Because again, you destroy incentives, you are collectively not producing. People don't have a need to produce. Everybody's thinking other person will produce. So it's never enough. There was shortage. He says that farmers had to knock on doors and beg for food. And he's saying we were farmers. We were supposed to produce food. To beg for food was not honorable. My face was burning. And that's what Ibn Khaldun is saying. People want the things. They want what they want. This is normal instinct. And not doing it yourself, begging others, right, removes some honor and dignity. That's why in another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, people who keep begging will come on the day of judgment without face. Because on the day of judgment, when you are begging and asking and somebody is giving you, you depend on others, you are trading your dignity and honor. And people here, they remember olden days when they were basically producing their own food, when they didn't have to beg. So now with this new way of doing stuff, he's saying, my face was burning. I have to beg for food. This was the way all over the China, the way entire economy was set up. So in the winter of 1978, after another terrible harvest, the farmers in this village came up with the idea. Idea was so dangerous, they had to call a secret meeting to discuss it. Think of that economy and society. Under excuse of communal and all of this nice talk, people are secretly meeting. When I remember in Yugoslavia, we had to secretly meet to watch a movie on Islam, Message, when I was a kid. We couldn't watch it. You couldn't do anything. My own parents would have to go to Romania to buy to sell food or to buy something that we didn't have. They would get the food sometimes from Greece, sometimes from Romania, and they would sell basic coffee, butter, jeans. And this was all black economy because you were not supposed to do that. If they get caught, you get in trouble. So think of that. I had to go to Greece to buy Vicrim, it's a type of spreadable thing. Can you believe how? So this was the extent, and people would kill you for a pack of coffee, and that's a basic coffee, not even the proper coffee, just a basic coffee. So here people are meeting secretly to talk about what they're gonna do. So 18 farmers gather in this small, dirty floored room. And this guy, Yen, was one of them. And he explained they were sitting on the floors, there was nothing to sit on, few chairs. There was an idea that they discussed. This is a radical idea now. Instead of farming as a collective, each family would get to farm its own plot of land. And if the family grew a lot of food, then family could keep some of that food. You own what you grow. They decided then to try this, and they decided to write it down as a formal contract so everyone is bound to it. Okay, so you understand the idea? So this is the land, we don't own it, but you work on your land, I'll work on my land. Whatever you make, you take what you need for yourself and continue pushing the rest to the state. State will take, but rather than we do it like that collective, no incentives, you want to be independent, halas, you do your thing, take the part of the profit from it. So then they write it down as a contract. It says that they are going to secretly divide up the land among the families, and it's end up with this: if any of us are put in prison or executed, the others in the group will raise their children until they are 18 years old. Think of that. This particular basic contract, how to work and organize yourself, can get you killed. So they commit on the secrecy. This is how we're going to do it. And if anybody is executed, find out that they are working more on their land, we take care of their children, okay? This farmer Yen ends up hiding this piece of bamboo in the roof of his house. This is the contract. And he remember first day that morning, how it felt for him going to what is now his own piece of land, where he's going to work and he's going to take what he makes. The interviewer asked him, did you work harder than before? And he said, of course I work harder. We all did, because whatever I produce was mine. If you don't work hard, that's your loss. And we all secretly competed. Everyone wanted to produce more than the next person. That got people working harder. In one of the interviews, I heard him like when he came first day on the farm this morning, he got up very early. He was even breathing and looking at everything differently. It was like completely new person. Like it's your thing now. I'm gonna get out earlier. I'm gonna get this done, organized. The completely different enthusiasm. So it's the same land, the same tool, same people. But just by changing the economic rules, by saying you get to keep some of what you grow, everything changes. Now, the farmers were terrified of being found out, but by the end of the season, it became impossible to keep things secret anymore because they've had enormous harvest. More food than in previous 5 years combined. First of all, does that make sense? It makes absolutely sense. That he would go to work hour earlier, stay hour later, work more diligently, employ whatever he could have from resources, get rid of everything that didn't work. No excuses, get up. And that harvest was more than everything else 5 years combined. What starts happening is that now, as he's taking for his needs, even his profit is now much larger than before. This started to alert people, police, local government, and big government. So they started thinking, what is going on with these people? Why is this region suddenly producing more? Even though they were consuming, but what they're going to do with the rest? They send the rest. So it suddenly flood. What's going on? Why there is so much? So at this moment, he gets a call from a local party official. They summon him to the office. So he says, the farmer, that when he got there, they would swear at him. They threatened him. Because at that time in the history, there was a debate in China. Some people were suggesting that they wanted to try different things in terms of the economy. And that was just 2 years after the death of Mao, previous president. So a lot of people were opposed to what was going there. So the more opening up away from state control of everything, because that was saying bad things about Mao and his collective farming. It was not seen as politically correct. Fortunately for the farmers, there were some powerful people who wanted to change things. So instead of executing these farmers, they started holding them as a model. So within a few years, farmers all over China adopted the principles in that secret document. People can own what they grow. The government launched other economic reforms, and China economy started to grow like crazy. So since 1978, something like 500 million people have risen out of poverty in China. Think of that number. 500 million people risen. Why? Why they were risen from poverty?
They were given an incentive to work.
Now, still there is a huge battle between what is state-owned, but by opening themselves, they have lifted through this mechanism. People lifted themselves out of 500 million. So think of this. Same thing happened in India. When the India has done the same thing, change economic model, hundreds of millions of people in the last couple of decades were lifted from poverty. Russia, again, same thing. Russia was, you look Russia, 1890s, a failed state, this total destruction. Now, they have done a lot of corrupt things where these oligarchs have took over the huge energy and other businesses, and that's a different story. But what propelled them were the same economic principles which remove the hand of the government and that sort of communist mentality that we will own everything and when we will decide what you get, and killing the incentives to work. This is a kind of interesting thing because going back to that moral hazard. So you think that the principles are there for no reason, then you are fooling yourself. You put the wrong incentives. You will have 500 million poor people there. When we look at this inequality, when we look at a lot of injustice, and when people talking about structural and other problems, often we are led by good intentions to solve these problems. But solutions where people can realize their dreams and economic prosperity is by designing the rules and incentives where those people can participate in that system and be rewarded and incentivized to take the risks. So how do we create system of opportunities for opportunities takers? How do we show how to catch the fish and create opportunities to participate in catching fish? Many people, including Muslims, they fall for idea of welfare state that is pushed by socialist and other communist movement that are based on the Marxist idea. I have good friends. They often argue. They say, oh, Islam is so close to socialism. This is not Islam. Medina was not a welfare socialist utopia. It was not also a capitalist, unethical economy. It was Islamic. It had clear rules, ethics, rights of individuals, freedoms, and encouraged circulation and creation of wealth, as well as personal and collective responsibility to look after less fortunate ones. So we would do ourselves a favor to educate ourselves a bit more. Between the left and right, there is Islamic way that goes beyond what left and right is telling us and teaching us. So inshallah, we'll talk about that in our next episode. I didn't give you too much chance to say.
That's okay.
You were mostly listening today.
Yeah.
I hope you had the opportunity to have some more coffee. And for everybody else, thank you very much for listening us. Inshallah, join us next week. As you know, these episodes are now published on Mondays. And we will see you next week. All the best. Assalamu alaikum.